Right. Yeah, I'm doing the bit about the different contexts, because we're all more familiar with preaching on a Sunday, but we've all been to baptisms, christenings, weddings, funerals, and yes, and there's preaching there. And how we preach in a baptism or weddings and funerals and schools and outside the normal Sunday is actually quite different to how we preach on a Sunday. Ashley talked about context, and that's going to be important. If you're preaching at a wedding, you don't want to do the same sermon that you preached at a funeral. It wouldn't work. But then you have to ask questions. Who is there? If it's a wedding, who is there? Now, put yourself in the place of the bride and groom. If you're a bride and groom, you do not want a preacher to be going on for half an hour, giving you the Fifth Amendment on how you're supposed to live your life. You want something that's memorable, something that encourages you on your journey. The other thing is, with weddings, we have to remember who is there. We live in a world where a lot of people getting married, they come from blended families. So there might be children from other partnerships. There might be acrimonious divorces somewhere in the family. There's so loss, divorce, hope, so many different things. So preaching at a wedding is not necessarily the place for us to air out any traditional views on marriage, but how to build up the couple who are starting to build a new family. One of the loveliest things that I've seen at a wedding was where there was a child from a previous relationship. And at the wedding, not only was the sermon given to the bride and groom, but given to the child, who was then formally invited. And what was really special was the new husband gave a ring to the little girl as well, to say, I promise to be a good dad to you. Now, how do you include that in your preaching? The inclusion, of what Christ has done, brought us all into one family. So you had a hook there that related to that family. Sometimes wedding sermons, we might not remember the sermon. Can you remember any of your wedding sermons if you're married? I can't remember. You can, yes. Well, the one I remember was nearly 38 years ago. I don't remember the sermon, but I remember a story. So actually, the importance of using story that is memorable. For our instance, it was a story of a bishop who was late for a very important meeting that was going to be really, really big. And as he was driving there, God said, go back and apologize to your wife. And he said, but it's God's work. And he said, go back and apologize. So story is really important. And that's what people will remember, is a story. They won't remember you doing a whole sort of exegesis on, 1 Corinthians 13 and the state of the Corinthian church and all that. But they will remember a story about how love is important. Going on to funerals, you've got almost the same thing. who is there. It's not going to be the church people. These are going to be, generally for funerals, you will have a lot of people who have never set foot into a church. So what you're going to say has to be relevant to them. What's the purpose of a sermon in a funeral? To bring hope and comfort. That it's a pastoral thing. So a funeral service, as with a wedding service, is not the place to do a full gospel, appeal. That isn't the place for it. And it's not our place at a funeral unless we really know the faith of the deceased. It is not our place to make any judgments as to whether they're going, where their eternal future lies. That isn't our responsibility, that's God's. But it's not our place to make those judgments certainly in the service. It's also important to link the sermon. You're not giving a eulogy, but it is good to link your sermon, what you're saying, with what you know of the life of the deceased. So, for instance, if they were someone who had a quiet, steady walk or loved the countryside, you might talk about Psalm 23 and walking through the valley of the shadow of death like they knew, or they loved the quietness and possibly found rest by still waters. Link what you know of the deceased and the family, and listen. The important thing is to listen, because you are bringing God's word into their situation of hurt. Of course, sometimes a funeral can be a celebration. If someone has lived a good, long life, then yes, well done, good and faithful servant. And you can bring in, a little bit of humor. But if it's someone that's had an untimely death or suffering, then obviously that is not the time to have a, well done, good and faithful servant, but a God remembering the God who walks with us in our pain. So looking at lament, it's who you think of the context totally and get named right. It is, at a wedding, if you get the names wrong, you can joke about it. At a funeral, if you get the names wrong, you can't joke about it. And if you start a funeral by starting off with the wrong order of service and welcoming them to a wedding, that will go down in history as being absolutely awful. So you listen, pay attention. The other thing is with a funeral is, quite often people, when it's a funeral, they don't know their Bibles very well. So you'll find the same texts coming out, or they might ask you, oh, what do you suggest? And there are texts, things like Psalm 23, things like, in my Father's house there are many rooms. There are familiar texts that we can use, but listen to the family. Other places that we preach, schools. Now, I've been privileged to do some schools work, And it's quite interesting because when you go into school for assemblies and that, you are going into a multi-faith area, unless it's a Church of England or a Catholic school. So it's multi-faith. But what's interesting is that they do have a strong curriculum. And the curriculum is broadly Christian. You are not allowed to proselytize, so no gospel messages. But you are allowed to tell the stories of Jesus, and the children love it. They love being interactive. And be surprised. Don't be surprised. We once did we were doing a thing called Open the Book, where basically you act out the Bible stories. But unlike the official thing, we got the children to act out the Bible stories. We were going through the story of Ruth. And so we had a little boy wearing a tea towel and a little girl wearing a shawl. And Boaz, of course, has to say, "Ruth, you're very pretty. I want to marry you." And the little boy who was playing Boaz said, "I can't say that. That's incest. She's my cousin." He was about 8. The children didn't know what was going on, but the teachers were absolutely howling with laughter. So don't be surprised. But that leads on to another thing. Children live in very complicated lives. We can't assume that, Father's Day, that they would want to talk about their daddy. They might not know who their daddy is. So don't, remember that a lot of children come from a very different background to what we think. But also make it relevant. How is a Bible story relevant to a child's life or a teenager's life? And the other thing that's really interesting is I was privileged to be on a local SACRE board. SACRE is the Standing Advisory Committee on Religious Education. And there are SACRE teams all around the country, and they just advise schools on religious education, but also on the curriculum. Now, just before we think that children in school don't learn about Christianity, one of the questions for, I think it's either GCSE religious studies or it's AS, is explain the resurrection and 2 views of it. And what is the importance of the resurrection to Christian life? That is deep. So don't assume that children don't know anything about our faith. If they don't go to church, they probably do. But again, it's not talking down to them. Listen to the children, listen to the teachers, because they will point out if there's any issues. So that's always really helpful. Other situations, preaching on the street. Personally, I'm not a great one of street preachers because most people are too busy passing by. But what are you saying? Again, listen to the context. In Wales, we had a Good Friday parade with the cross and preaching the gospel all the way through on Good Friday into the marketplace. The problem was it was also market day. So you had someone shouting the story of the crucifixion over someone shouting, "Come and buy my tomatoes." Yeah, listen to the context. If you're preaching outside, why are you preaching? Who are you preaching to? You know, and make it something that's short and encouraging. You know, too often I've heard street preachers telling all and sundry that they're doomed. People want good news. So most of all in all of this, it's listen to the context. You know, yes, you can have certain funerals, you can have humor, but you have to listen to the context. Weddings, listen to the bride and groom, listen to the family. You know, the last thing you want to do at a wedding is preach something that will antagonize, you know, great Aunt Ethel that's sitting at the back who can wield a stick. You know, you want to encourage everyone. And it is a real privilege. And then again, thinking about baptisms, you know, you're preaching about discipleship. Again, listen to the situation. And with dedications, you know, yes, you're thanking God for the child, but also a dedication isn't your place then to dictate on how that child should be brought up. You know, it's our place to actually say, well, what does God think about children? What does God think about the place of the child and the family? Where are the families in the Bible? And again, keep the main point the main point. You know, if it's a wedding, make sure it's a wedding sermon. If it's a funeral, make sure it's comforting, that it brings hope. You know, because most of all, what you're doing in these situations is being pastoral. And the best way to be pastoral is just to listen. So I think that's all that for that little bit.